Welcome, everybody. This is Gary Schulteis with Global eLearning. I'm joined by Matt Patterson, who is also from Global eLearning, and Ray Walsh, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But just wanted to welcome everybody to Global eLearning's 2021 Thought Leader Series. This is a continuation of a conference, an all-day conference that we held last November 10th. And we got such a great response to that virtual conference. We had 9 hours of content. And this year, knowing that the COVID pandemic has started to allow us, we're getting a hold of it so that we're allowed to start meeting face to face. Instead of holding another virtual conference, we're now doing a series every month of guest speakers on topics that are basically super important, very critical to our world of global communications and being localized into different cultures and covering a multilingual world. So our guest today is Ray Walsh. He's our first in our series of 6. Ray, welcome to our broadcast. Ray is a consultant of doing internal communications and localization. He has written a book. He's a featured speaker. And most of all, he's a very busy man that he was able to squeeze us in today on this live broadcast. So Ray, I'm very grateful that you could join us on a topic that is super near to our hearts on what we do in the localization world, what you do in the internal communications of a global workforce. So let's start off with that very topic. Those two things cross over and overlap in a big way. What have you seen when you put out that you're a consultant for both of those things, communications and localization? What is it that you have done in your professional career that's made you aware that this is a critical element of how a global workforce works?
Right. Well, thanks for having me. It's dear to my heart as well. So I'm really grateful to be here. I've been in internal communications for about 20 years. I started out my career in Chicago, and in very many ways, I'm just an ordinary internal comms guy. I look for content, I create content. But in 2007, I moved to Europe, and I'm still based here. I'm based in Prague. And from this perspective, I start to see the classic internal communications just starting to stumble. People aren't really paying attention to it very much. They develop their own local channels. I just don't see it working very well. So I began to, I was in what year was it? It was about 2016. I was working as an internal comms manager in Brussels. And I started to research this localization world, which I had only just began to hear about. And at that time, we were developing content, trying to get Europeans to come to the intranet more. So, we had somebody in France to do French language content, and we had somebody in Germany to do it for Germany, somebody in the UK, because the Queen's English is also different from, and this was also an American company. And so we moved the needle. We got more readership. We increased the use of the channel, and that was a win. But so I started researching what I thought was just going to be a slim little self-published pamphlet, which eventually became this book called Localizing Employee Communications. But I was seeing Anne Rockley speak, and she was talking about handcrafting content, like we're artisanal, creators, and each piece of content is unique. And I thought it was like a light bulb for me. I thought that's exactly the way we work, and we spend so much time making this content unique for France and unique for Germany, and yet there's so much repetition of processes. So this concept of content operations, which I learned from Anne Rockley and Val Swisher's writing and Rahel Bailey's writing, made me think that there's got to be a way for us in internal communications to do that too, to start thinking more like an operation and less like a centralized newsroom.
Yeah.
So that's it was a long research process, but I think so. But you asked specifically about the reaction to it, and most companies they'll just shrug and say, well, that's really complicated to do internal comms in a lot of languages. It's too expensive. We don't have the time for that. Our budget's constantly getting cut. Our headcount is constantly getting reduced. We're asked to do more with less. We can't even begin to think about localizing. And this idea, I think, of content operations is very useful, because then we can start cooperating with the people in marketing and and vendors like you and people in learning and development and HR to really start assembling something that's more consistent and easy to use.
That's good. In our world, Ray, we do a lot of work with companies that obviously are global. They have offices in many different countries, or at least in some, and we are doing the localization, the translation of sometimes just documents, but a lot of times it's multimedia content. And we understand that when we do that, that companies want to make sure that it's done well and done professionally. So they often will send it to those offices and in another location and ask them to actually approve or look at it and all these things. From a standpoint of having us do that versus the opposite, which is companies that say, hey, look, we have this English policy, let's say, and they send it off to let's say, over to Prague in the Czech Republic, and they say, can someone over there go ahead and put this into Czech for all the local staff? That's a real burden, isn't it, on somebody in the Czech Republic to have to then say, I have a full-time job, and now I also am asked to translate or to localize content for our staff here. Is it not better to have it brought over by a professional language company, and then you can say, you know what, there might be some feedback, a little bit of changes necessary to get it into the voice of the company, but other than that, it's already in our language. Can you speak to the fact that of the burden of having to do translation when you're already based in another country?
Right. So I would say the vast majority of companies, global companies, are doing business only in English. And even the people in Europe say, well, you have to have one language. How can you possibly do business in multiple languages? So I'm trying to convince them that, you know, that we can do more. But having said that, there is still sometimes these global organizations that some training they do localize or they do translate. And as you pointed out, it is often a bigger burden on the local countries than they realize. So, you know, some trainings, maybe it's IT security compliance, and they might have their own local reviewers, or HR has a training that they do once a year, and they have their own local reviewers, or the compliance group. But in the small countries, especially where they may only have, I don't know, 50 employees, say, that review, regardless of what department it's coming from, is probably going to be the same person. And that can be a huge bottleneck, you know. So it's like, let's say they've got this annual compliance training and September is the year that it needs. So this person has to do all of that review, and it's also their busiest season. And it just creates all these huge bottlenecks, and the corporate office rarely sees that. So I do think that they would certainly appreciate having professional language review, so they can just quickly review it for the quality of content for that office. And that's really important. I mean, I started out researching the book thinking mostly about language and culture, but as I got further into it, I realized, well, there's actually quite a bit of different country to country just based on their product focus.
Right.
So if the corporate office is putting out a training about their B2C portfolio of products, and some of those products aren't available in the Czech Republic, well, then that training is either, you know, irrelevant, or it's actually can be confusing because maybe it has, these are our marketing statements about our portfolio, and the newcomer or the person taking the training is like, I don't understand. I've never heard of that product before. Are we supposed to sell that now? I didn't catch that. And then it just creates all kinds of problems. So the review is critical. They have to review it for the relevance for that market. Is it appropriate for that market? And if the language and the quality of the content is already there, I think they would greatly appreciate the time saved.
Right.
Yeah, Ray, can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? Would you recommend these larger global companies to have a full-time reviewer for content that's coming through, as opposed to them doing their full-time job plus reviewing? Would it be fiscally smart for them to have a full-time reviewer on hand if there were enough translations coming in?
From my perspective, I think so. I think it's mostly from a perspective of risk, because many of them have been doing this way for years. and you're telling them now that they absolutely have to have a full-time reviewer. They don't really want to believe that, but I do think it mitigates the risk. I think there are a lot that can go wrong if they don't have that, if they don't have somebody devoted to it. And I think if we think more about that content operations model, I think we can actually save everybody a lot of time and a lot of grief. If I could just skip ahead to like a quick example of that.
Please.
For one client I have right now, they've been doing these town halls on a monthly basis, and the questions over and over and over again are like, what's happening with our B2C strategy? And from a communications perspective, we've been writing about it. We just don't understand why aren't they picking this up? But in fact, the B2C strategy is a fairly nuanced and fairly complex and somewhat changing thing. So they're really, we could write another article about it, but people aren't reading our articles for the most part. It's just not sinking in. So maybe a better place for that would be in training, particularly for onboarding. So there's a segment about this is our B2C strategy, and it would be really great. And this is more of maybe a content ops kind of thinking. It would be really great if that were kept up to date. So, later this year, the B2C strategy might shift a little, or maybe they roll out something that, that needs to be mentioned. So having that up to date and in language and easily accessible to the L&D or someone like you to put it together and make sure that it's up to date and in language and appropriate. I think we could streamline that and I think we could save everybody a lot of time and maybe some money as well.
Yeah. One of the things, Ray, that we discovered is that we could do the best job in the world at localizing, let's say, a sales strategy for a company. Let's say they have a sales strategy and they want this to be presented to all of their global staff in different countries. So we're localizing it into, let's say, 5 or 6 different languages. And we could do that beautifully and do it perfect. And then find out that some of the countries would come back and say, we don't like this. We don't like this Japanese version. And we say, well, what's wrong with the translation of it? And they would say, well, the translation is okay. It's just that that's not the way we do sales here in this country, And so we have learned that often one of the first questions we'll ask a client is, are we sure that the strategy you're trying to do here in the United States is exactly the way you're going to do the strategy in another country, or does it need to be amended? So that, in a sense, our source content that we're going to localize may be adjusted, and there may be a Japanese version of that strategy or an Italian version of that strategy that we need to amend first, and then we'll localize it appropriately through the videos and through the words and all the text. But is that true? I mean, often there's a strategy that a company has that's based in the United States that is just not, it's not the way they execute in other countries. And there needs to be room for that.
Absolutely. I've seen many examples of that. Plastics manufacturing, professional services, where else comes to mind? But, very often, let's say a professional services company in Germany, they speak English generally pretty well, but they're pretty much focused on the automotive industry. And in Ireland, obviously they speak English, but they're very focused on the pharmaceutical industry. In that plastics manufacturer, again, Germany focused on high-tech manufacturing for high-end cars, whereas in the Asian markets, the materials they were producing were for more, kitchen appliances and small devices. So how they sell and who they sell to and how they talk about it is very different. So I do think you raise a very good point. Culture and language are important. Don't want to skip over that, but what exactly is the content, and is it appropriate for this market?
Right. Yeah, and one other thing, Ray, just in describing the automobile industry, there, I don't know if you noticed, but you use multiple terms for a car, and that's something.
That's
When you brought it up earlier, you said that engineering might have their own reviewer and marketing might have their own reviewer, and to bring it back to that, having a full-time reviewer on your staff to do it, that it ensures consistency, right? Because engineering might call it an automobile and marketing might call it a car, and another group might call it something else. So it pulls in that consistency by having that one reviewer that knows, hey, here's what we're going to call it, here's what we're going to do. Because from our end, on the localization side, we can have glossaries, we can have all of that set up. But ultimately, if the customer comes to us and says, we need this, we need these changes accepted, then we kind of have our hands tied. We can tell them, well, your other group's calling it an automobile. Are you sure you don't want to call it that? But if they say our sales team calls it cars, then we have our hands tied with that, and it makes keeping up with that glossary even harder.
Absolutely, and I think you make a very good point that that in-house reviewer is very important. When another thing, when you kind of crowdsource it, somebody does it this month and then somebody else does it the next month, it does lead to other problems too. Like, in some markets, they may have already decided that, the name for this process, we're just going to use the English. It works for France, and we're just going to call it that. And then 2 months down the road, somebody translates that process word for word into French, and now somebody sees it, and so now they're actually confused. Are we talking about the same thing? Did they introduce a new process? So yes, consistency from month to month. It's not just it's a real time and money saver. I'm really convinced of it. So I think to make that case you were talking about, maybe that in-house reviewer really is a good investment.
Yeah.
Well, Ray, let me make a plug for something that we believe in and that we need from the clients that we have. Our global clients often will do a localized product, and one of the things that we desperately need is that internal reviewer. If we send it, let's say, to the Czech Republic, that internal reviewer needs to be somebody who is consistent. What we can't afford is to have someone who changes all the time, because, as you know, when you say something in another language, you can say it in many different ways. And so if you have multiple internal reviewers, they'll end up saying, they'll have different preferences. And then we're constantly in a battle, try to maintain that consistency becomes a real issue. For us, one of the things we do, and that I think is very valuable, is we take internal reviewers and we have our team of linguists, which we keep very consistent. And if that internal reviewer is the same person for a long period of time, we get them into communication together so that when we start doing our translation work, we already know the preferred style of the internal reviewer, so that we get it right the first time when we actually do a localized product. And we don't have a lot of going back and forth, which puts somebody like yourself, let's say, as the point of contact, and you just want to get this thing finished, and you're caught because you don't necessarily speak that language, but you're being told that it's not right and so one of the things that we try to do is get that internal reviewer to connect with our linguist team so that we have the same page. We're aligned on how we want to look at things. We have a glossary, we have a style guide, and we do things very consistently. And we found that to be very, very successful for companies, particularly when they want to have their own voice. And many companies say, I don't necessarily want that formal voice in Japanese. I want something that's more personable, and they want to develop a voice that is clearly their own. And that takes work between an internal reviewer and a language team to get that just right.
I think that would be a real luxury for us. That would be great. I think that the content operations world, they have fancy tools that would make these things easier. We're often dealing with manual processes and spreadsheets. So what you're describing sounds like a beautiful thing, because our content reviewers very often complain, I made this change last year, or I made this change 6 months ago. Why are we still,
That's right.
What that manual process can be really painful, and it's frustrating for them. And then they start doing the work a little more, with a little less care, because they feel like, well, no one's paying attention to my review anyway.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Ray, I'd like to dive in. So Global eLearning, we are we translate content for the learning and development community. And one thing I get quite often is, our company requires everyone to speak English. Yeah. So we keep our content in English. And even when we send it globally, we send our trainings in English to everyone. What I'd like to do is just talk to you a little bit from what you've seen from internal communications about the risks of keeping stuff just in English when you're sending it to your colleagues worldwide.
There are risks, and actually both sides are right. They've been doing business in English for decades, and nothing terrible has happened. But I do think they are taking some risks, and I think a very sophisticated, experienced business people just underestimate these risks, including the communications department. So sitting here in Europe, I mean, I can name rattle off just a few. The first one is legal compliance. You know, there is local labor law that requires certain aspects of employee experience to be in local language, and if you're presenting it in English, you know, you're causing local HR some headaches at a minimum, but you may actually run into some legal trouble. An example of that, I was working with a plastics firm here in a global company, not a huge one, but they had production facilities all around the world, and I was told by the communications director, it's a high-tech environment. Everybody here is educated, English only. It's really not an issue. And then a few weeks later, I was in a Belgian manufacturing facility, one of theirs, talking with the director of the plant there, and I asked him about the communications that we were creating, and how is it landing, and is there anything we can do that's better? And he looked at me confused, like, what are you talking about? I don't share any of that with employees because he was interpreting local labor law to be like, I can't share this. So the stuff that we were creating, including like safety content and all that we were imagining for employees, was actually only going to their management level. And to follow up on that, they had their own newsletter, which they created, which looked, colors are off, and I don't speak Dutch, so probably the messaging was off too, I would imagine. But this brings up the topic of, second risk, something I call shadow localization. I'm borrowing the term from shadow IT. Those are the IT workarounds outside of the network that people form, like WhatsApp groups and so on. Shadow localization would be local newsletters, local SharePoints with those HR docs and so on, which kind of over time evolve into the local intranet. I've never seen the global organization that sanctions these things. I have never seen the global organization successful in stopping them. They're just going to keep coming. So from my perspective, I think it's better that we enable them with good quality stuff, assets and key messages and things in language that they can easily use to make it easy for them to put into those things. So I think that mitigates the risk of shadow localization, which I think is very real. And then another risk is adoption of technologies. Many companies now are talking about digital transformation, moving things to the cloud, and they're rolling out all of these new tools. And it's interesting that a lot of these software as a service vendors, they have support in dozens of languages, but our communication about it is all in English. So, and I think that they put it all in those languages for a very good reason. If you want people to change behaviors, it's better to speak to them in a language that's easy for them to use. So I think if we're constantly having to please adopt this tool, and we're doing it in English, I just think we're gonna have to work a lot harder at it.
Yeah, I think it lets your global employees know that you care as a company because you're putting it into their language. I think it empowers them. I think it gives them, it gives the company more chance on missing a high potential candidate to move up in the company by putting it into another language. I think there are tremendous benefits with that. And a while back, I read a study that 90% of people prefer to learn in their native language.
Sure.
Now, the 10% there that it makes up are people that have been put into a country for 30 years, right? And they now dream in that language. But typically, what you dream in is what you prefer to learn in. So if you dream in English, then you probably want some English. If you dream in French, then you probably want to learn in French because it's going to sink in better. It's going to make more sense to you that way. And you're not having to do the translation in your head of reading it in French and then translating it to English or vice versa, right? So it's interesting that the benefits are there. I think the reason we get that pushback is because they're hard to put a dollar value to, right? Because how do you measure a real safety increase? Maybe you're not cutting down on people falling off ladders, but maybe you are making it safer overall because now people really understand what's going on and what could happen if a chemical spill happened or something like that. So some of those values are hard to put in dollars.
Yes, that's a very interesting point. Especially on a topic like safety, there are cultural values in it, and if we just translate it from the head office in the U.S., it's just infused with American values, and there's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but that plastics company I was talking about, they had, they were having accidents in India. The corporate message was safety is the very highest priority, but yet they kept having these accidents in India. So something's going wrong there. And I suppose, honestly, there could be several contributing factors to that. But one of them, I think, must be that the content about safety doesn't speak to their values. It sounds like it's coming like this foreign voice.
Right.
It's translated, but it's, I understand it, but it just doesn't speak to me.
Yeah, I would say this, Matt and Ray, one of the things I found in starting businesses overseas in communities where they didn't speak English, by putting things into a local language, I unleashed the innovation of our workers, because one of the things they want to do is be successful. They would like to make a name for themselves. They would like to make a difference. They would like to improve processes. They would like to be more efficient. I mean, it's a basic thing among workers that they see things that they would like to change. And if you don't give them the ability to say, okay, here's the process in Spanish or in your language so that you can go ahead and explain to me what you really need, what you would like to see different, we're missing out on the innovation of these workers. I learned more from them than I could ever teach from my values, from my United States point of view, because they showed me what it was like to do things there. And I thought that was very important. Let me ask you this, Ray, as we're coming out of this pandemic last almost 15 months, and communication has been changed drastically. How we communicate with one another using this platform of a basically a video type of conference. What do you see, and what advice would you give to leaders of companies who say, I want to be a better communicator. I want to be a better communicator to everyone in my global organization. What advice would you give?
I would say, I think that there's generally a tendency for, business people. I'm in finance, or I'm in procurement, or, I'm in HR. Communicating, Ray, is your job. You're in the communications department. So the first advice I say was like, well, that's fine. And we will keep producing content. We will do our best to enable a free flow of information. We'll do the best we can. But I want those managers to understand you cannot rely on us for all of the communicating. Somebody gave me an analogy once. He said, I take the subway, to go somewhere. I don't take the subway to read the ads. And and we, the corporate communications department, we're the ads on the subway. They come to our intranet to do something else. And if they happen to catch one of our articles, great. But it's not anywhere near 100% of the headcount that are reading them. So I really want them to know that that you, manager, are the communicator, and we are your air cover. We're supplementing it with our, with our messaging. So I want them to know that they have a real responsibility to communicate on matters of strategy and high level stuff. And I would actually advise, please use our content. So if we write an article about an internship program, it's usually like a typical, photo of 6 interns in Germany, and they just finished their program and everybody had a good time. And yes, everybody was so nice, end of article. Yeah. It may not seem particularly relevant to your team, but you could take that piece and you could lead a discussion with your team and you'd say, did you see that article this week? It makes me wonder if next year, is there something that we could do with an intern? Is there some project that we could put them on? And now you're having a discussion on a team level about business planning or resource planning. So you're connecting the high level kind of global stuff, which is abstract by definition, and you're connecting it to the week to week reality of your team. And that's what I'd really, I think that would, that kind of relevance and that kind of, and frankly, it's a kind of localization, even though we may not necessarily be talking about language. They're localizing the concept for their team. Right. And that's what I would urge them to do.
Good.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. There is one thing that I'd like to talk about when creating content from an internal communication standpoint, because this is like I said, Ray, this is your world, right? So when you are in the thick of things and you're creating this content, in general, do you think teams understand cultural differences from one to, like, for example, the levels, there are 7 levels of formality in Japanese. So whenever you're sending something over there, you have to make sure it's the right level of formality. Are we addressing generals or somebody that needs to have the top level of formality? Or, for example, I had one client that said they were a theme park and they said, we just want it to be fun. Like, we want it to be the least formal as possible. We just want this manual to be fun. When you create content, is that something you guys think about, or do you think most teams even consider cultural formalities that come into play?
Unfortunately, I don't think most headquarters teams, we in America are famous for not knowing much about the rest of the world, but frankly, also our colleagues in the UK can be quite ignorant of the rest of the world too. So in the Anglosphere, we don't know very much. And to be fair to them, though, it's extremely difficult to write general content that applies to the whole world. Yeah. There's just levels of formality, and the American leadership style is very down to earth, trying to speak to people as ordinary, ordinary colleagues. But, we tend to use words like, oh, it's awesome work you're doing. And, we're very, we've got a reputation for being very enthusiastic and flag waving, and that style just doesn't always translate. So I guess, we do think about it. We don't always come up with a solution. I guess what I advise clients to do is go ahead and run with that content, in the US or in the UK. It's good local content, but you should also create a plain language version of that and send that to the countries ahead of time that have their own communication channels. Maybe it's just your top markets, or maybe it's everybody, but give them a plain language version, and then they can put in their words like, awesome, or whatever, whatever words are appropriate to their market. They can make those adjustments. It's quite, if it's a large company in multiple markets, it's really impossible for a communications department to make all those adjustments.
That's really good. Ray, I think from a standpoint of our questions and our topics and everything, I think we've covered most of what we want to cover. I would like to give you an opportunity because we're so appreciative of your time. How do people reach you, and how do they get a hold of some of your content?
I'll jump right into that, but I do want to just pause for just a moment. Thanks again for having me. I think the opportunities for the crossover between internal communications and L&D is so much stronger than it could. It could be so much stronger than it actually is in most companies. I think, because there's L&D is like the long-term communication, and I'm like the day-to-day, and I just feel like we could coordinate it much better. And I for example, rolling out a tool in Europe, say it's a expense reimbursement tool or something like that, or maybe it's enterprise social. We're going to introduce Yammer into our workplace. And what they don't understand is that in Europe, any change in workplace conditions has to go through Works Council review, which can take months. Now, we in internal comms can help them. We can advise them, and we can help guide them through all those processes. So I think, reach out to internal comms to help with that kind of traffic cop kind of work, here in Europe and in Asia as well, and the Americas. I believe they have their own kind of structures that we in the U.S. may not be aware of. But you can help us in terms of what generally happens with L&D communities is that they come to us, okay, we're having our compliance training in October. We need you to start communicating it. They come to us in, just a couple of weeks later, and then both of us in tandem are nagging employees constantly, please take the training, please take the training. I think we could work together more successfully before and after that training. Bite-sized pieces of content on that compliance or that anti-harassment or that anti-corruption, bite-sized pieces of content that we can slate into our channels is extremely useful. And that's also extremely useful to line level managers, because they can use that content. They can put it on Yammer, or they can put it into a presentation and share with their teams. Bite-sized pieces of content get much more traction and spread much more, especially if you've localized it. That makes it even more valuable. And also, frankly, you and L&D are probably, you as a company definitely are, but even our colleagues in-house in L&D are probably using more sophisticated globalizing tools. They may have more knowledge about how things land culturally, whereas we in the communications department, we just may be ignorant of that. So I think we can advise each other and help each other out to really, getting employee attention is so difficult. And getting them to pay attention to what's important is so difficult. And I think we can help each other in the long term.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Ray. I think I think it's brilliant to get corporate communications and L&D together. And really, I've always kind of been of the opinion that they should be kind of nested in the same department, right next to each other, at least have their cubicles right across from each other, or their offices right near each other, because it just makes sense. Like, you both foundationally have the same goal, right? Because you are communicating to your employees. You want them to soak in that content. So I really appreciate you putting that out there, because it is important for both groups to start working better in tandem together.
Totally agree. I can say this though, Ray, if you don't mind, make sure that as an internal communication group, one of the things we face is bringing into the table very late. So for instance, you thing out and you know that you've got to hit like 5 or 7 or 10 different languages to be able to hit the rest of your organization. We're brought into it at the last minute, and we're told, hey, in 24 hours, we got to get a message out from our president to everybody. And we say, well, we can do that, but this is a real rush environment for us to try to pull this off in 24 hours. One of the things you can always do for us is bring us in as early as possible. When you know that you're going to have something that has to go out in all these languages, help us to be prepared so that we can get it done right for you and we don't have any mistakes on those other languages, because you're doing it in maybe one single language and then you want it out into 10 others. Those 10 others are just as important to be effective, to be engaging, and to get exactly the accuracy right. So we want to get it right. We don't want to be pushed and for something so important as that message.
Yeah.
We in internal comms were envious of your industry's ability to put a premium on last minute rush jobs.
You do see the white hair though, don't you? Ray? You see the white hair?
Yeah. I mean, last minute requests. We coach our leaders all the time. Like, we really this is difficult. It's a tough task, and then when you're dealing with multiple languages, you're talking about a very much increased price tag and probably definitely much less effective.
Right.
Yeah, and it's funny, right? Because I get these requests that say, "Hey, we're going to have something coming to you," and I get it last week, and here it'll be Wednesday, and it still hasn't come to me. And then they say, "We need this in 24 hours." By the way, and I'm like, "You just spent a week
warned you.
working on the English. Like, you spent a week working on the English, and we have less than 24 hours to put this into 10 languages." Yeah, it certainly is. There's a reason those rush premiums are there, because look at Gary's hair. That's all we can say.
That's all we can say. Wait, let's get back, because I really do want you to let people know how they get a hold of you. What are things that they can be aware of that you'll be speaking to in the near future? Tell us a little bit about what you have planned in the next few months of your professional life.
Well, thank you for that. Well, my name, as was written on the page here, Ray Walsh, and I, like I said at the beginning, I'm an ordinary content consultant. But what I'm interested in is how that internal content plays globally. And I think there are so many things we can do to make it more effective. Some of them are free. I would say most of them are free, just in a shift in our attitude. But then I think there are also some processes and that we can learn from and start applying. So I'm looking at this concept of concept operations and what our colleagues in technical writing are doing with that, because they're years ahead of us in terms of the number of languages they're dealing with and the number of updates that they're doing. But I think they have a great deal to teach us. So I started this process researching the localization industry and produced my book, Localizing Employee Communications. And that was more, I think when that book was focused on the internal communications function, how can we do better at reaching global audiences? But by reframing it as content operations, I can now start working with people like you. I can start working with other groups and just broaden that to be more inclusive of all of our content needs. So I will be blogging about that. I'm active on LinkedIn. My website there, thank you for presenting that, raywalsh.net. You can see my contact details there. My LinkedIn profile is probably the best way. There's also some content on YouTube, and you'll find that link on my website as well.
Excellent.
And also, I would welcome anybody to make contact with me on any questions of this, because I feel like we're really in the early stages of thinking about how to deliver internal content globally.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I can testify to that, Ray, because we reached out to you in late April. You said, I have only one day in this week that I could give to you, and you gave it to us. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much for joining us. And for our audience, like I said, this is a thought leader series presented by Global eLearning. We will be doing 5 more in this series. The next one is scheduled for June the 15th. Our featured guest will be David Kelly, who is the executive director of the Learning Guild. David had a presentation. He was a keynote speaker at our conference last November. He was excellent, and he has so many thoughts on how we can communicate as leaders going forward, particularly in a post-pandemic world. I think it's going to be fascinating to talk to him. So again, thank you for joining us. Ray, thank you for joining us. Matt, we look forward to having our next guest on June the 15th.
Yes.
Goodbye, everybody.